My name is Steve Maybie, M-A-B-I-E. This is my wife Nancy, and we're here because June England called and asked for somebody to come and give a little talk. We are associated with the San Antonio Genealogical and Historical Society. Right now, I'm the treasurer. Nancy's the assistant treasurer. Come June, I will be the president, and Nancy will be one of the vice presidents.
Oh, great.
So, yes, there should be 3 separate handouts right now. If you look at the 2 black and white ones, you should have eventually 3 separate packages. 2 of them are among my favorite handouts. The larger one, the first page, is called the Physical Regions of the United States. Now, what my talk's about is how people got from the East Coast to the rest of the country. As I'm sure most of you realize, the original settlers on the East Coast started landing in 1608 in Jamestown, 1622 in Massachusetts, 1624 in New York, New Amsterdam at the time. And they stayed there for an awfully long time. My family started out in New Amsterdam. That's where the Maybies came from. And one of my ancestors moved up to a farm 6 miles outside of the town of Schenectady, New York. And he built a house there in 1705. And until the Revolution, that was the furthest west that anybody lived.
Man.
I mean, that was the western frontier. Think about it. That's 15 miles west of Albany, New York.
That's not very far.
And that was the western frontier.
Would you please tell us the year that was?
1705 is when he built the house.
Okay.
That house, by the way, remained in our family through one branch of the family until 1993, at which time it was donated to the Schenectady County Historical Society, and is currently an educational facility operated by that historical society. So that's one of the sheets talks about one of the barriers to Western migration, and that was just the physical characteristics of our continent. We have 2 major mountain ranges. One of them that very few people think about over in the East Coast, the Adirondack, the Appalachians, the Adirondack chain, and of course the Rocky Mountains in the west. And in between we have a lot of rivers that at times helped and at other times impeded. The second page of this big handout is a very interesting set of charts, and the author, by the way, is on all these. Her name is Carrie Eldridge. These 4 charts show the Western civilization as it migrated across the Appalachian Mountains in each of the years designated there. 1783 when the country first started, 1800, 1815, and 1850. And it's very interesting to watch the flow of people and how slow it was initially. So we're going to talk about how that happened and why it happened. The second set of charts that I think you'll find interesting starts out with a page that cites a website, and this is right off the internet. It's called How Fast You Can Travel Across the United States. And it consists of snapshots in time of 4 years. The first year is 1800. The second year is 1830. The third year is 1857 of all years. And finally, the last year is 1930. And these charts are all centered on assuming you start out in New York City, which is where an awful lot of immigrants started out. And it shows how long it took a family to get to various points in the States. And it tends to end with the farthest point west in that time frame. So I thought you'd find that interesting. If you want to go to the website, it's the URL for it is on the first page. So the first question is, why did it take so long to get off the East Coast? People were there, like I said, since the mid-1600s at the latest, but they didn't proceed past those Appalachian Mountains. Well, there was two problems. Problem number one is, given the transportation modes at the time, without airplanes, without high-speed travel, there was really only 4 ways to get from the East Coast to inland. Everybody knows about one of those ways, and that's the Cumberland Gap. Everybody in school has heard about the Cumberland Gap. It's a little gap in the Appalachian Mountains that allows transit for wagons, people walking, and it's located roughly at the intersection of the states of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And that little gap in the mountains was a primary way of people getting through, okay? But it turns out there was 3 other ways that people never talk about. You probably didn't learn in high school or grade school. One of them is the Mohawk River Valley in New York. Now, for a long time, the Mohawk Valley was used by traders going west. I mentioned my ancestor's house that he built in 1705. It's right on the Mohawk River. Like I said, about 15 miles, or about 6 miles outside of Schenectady. Its location is right where there was a rapids. So there was a need to portage the boats around the rapids at that time. And so he built a hotel. Sounds fancy, a hotel. It was a 2-story building with 2 rooms, one upstairs and one downstairs. The upstairs had a lot of mattresses thrown around the floor, 1 room, and whoever wanted to stay the night had to pay them to sleep on a mattress. The other room had a big table where they served dinner. And according to the diaries of people who went through there, the dinner most often consisted of chicken, and they complained frequently about that in the diaries. That Mrs. Maybie would only make chicken. But the people going up that river at that time were largely traders, fur traders, hunters, adventurers. Very few families going up there. The second way of getting up there into the western part of the country is a little known path from New Jersey, actually western New Jersey, up the Delaware River into New York State, and from there you have flatlands all the way into the Ohio in western Pennsylvania. That was used an awful lot by people coming from the East Coast. And it was a lot faster to go that way than it was to travel all the way down to Virginia to get the Cumberland Gap and then go west. And you could get into the Ohio River Valley, and once you were into the Ohio River, you had access all the way down to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. So that's the second way. The third way, of course, was to take a boat around Florida. And there were a lot of people that did that and came in via Galveston and New Orleans. They were the primary 2 ports. The other reason, besides the Appalachian Mountains, that very few people ventured over to the west before 1790 was what was called at the time the Proclamation of 1763. That was part of the settlement of the French and Indian War between the British and the French and the Indians who were a party to that, the Native Americans. And if you look at the first of the colored handouts, there's a dotted line that runs down right along the western edge of the pink side. That is the line of the Proclamation of 1763. Basically, under that proclamation, the white settlers had everything to the right of that line, to the east of the line. The Native Americans had right to everything on the left of the line. As is evident from this, that didn't last very long, because if you look, there's a second line that starts out in the north along the same line as the Proclamation of 1763. It follows a series of dots following the Ohio River on to the Mississippi. That was the Proclamation of 1767, so 4 years later. The English were decided that the Native Americans didn't really need the land that currently is occupied by Mississippi and Alabama and Kentucky, Tennessee. And they decided that they would help themselves to that land. So at the time of the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, basically this is what civilization looked like, this first color page. That changed drastically by the time of the United States existence. And the second chart actually is from 1772, and it shows the colonies and the lands that they were claiming. And as you can see, colonies such as Virginia and North Carolina and Mississippi were claiming large swaths of land, and actually their claims went all the way to the Pacific. It's one thing to claim the land, it's another to occupy it. And the third chart that's in here is from the time of the Revolution, and this shows how the states, how that went from the colonies and what they were claiming to the states and what they were claiming. But again, if you compare this chart, which is from 1783, to the, on the one hand, the population chart from that same time frame, about 1800, they weren't really progressing much. The biggest progress was the blurb in the area of Tennessee and Kentucky, and that was almost all through the Cumberland Gap. Now, what we found in doing a lot of research is these were not necessarily new immigrant families coming in. There were an awful lot of families that actually originated in Connecticut, and if you have lines that you tend to lose somewhere around 1800 or 1780, you might want to look in Connecticut, because there were a whole lot of people in Connecticut. They were, in the early 1700s, they were largely Congregationalists. That's where the Baptist Church started. Up there was Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and in the Congregationalist churches in Connecticut. And an amazing number of people left Connecticut and settled in other parts of the country in the 1770 to 1800 range to spread the Baptist Church, the preachings of the Baptist Church. One such family, it turns out, one of our sons lives outside of Atlanta, and he married a girl who, one of her ancestors is Paulk, P-A-U-L-K. And they didn't know where the Paulks came from. They were Southern Georgia families, right? Now they were from Connecticut. The Paulks were among a group of Baptists that moved down from central Connecticut into North Carolina. and they started a church in the center of North Carolina that spread out with satellite churches all through South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. And that whole area was occupied by a bunch of people that started out in Connecticut. Then they went through the gap or around the mountains and started going into Alabama and Mississippi, wherever else they felt like going. Nancy's has a family line, the West family that we traced back to North Carolina. Turns out they came from Baltimore. They were actually not quite Baltimore, north of Baltimore in the Chesapeake Bay. What's the river that comes down? Anyway, it flows right into the Chesapeake River, and there's a rich valley there where they were growing. No, where 3 Mile Island is. That river flows right past Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right down into the Chesapeake Bay.
Susquehanna?
Susquehanna, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm getting old.
Welcome.
Yeah, you're in the right place.
Yeah.
So what we found is that a lot of families from unlikely places wound up down into the Carolinas and then migrating into Mississippi and Tennessee. So you might be surprised if you have a brick wall that's somewhere in there that might be worth looking into. Check Connecticut, check Baltimore or Maryland. The other major change that impacted getting through the Appalachians, of course, occurred in 1825. 1825 was the official opening of the Erie Canal. Okay? If you look at any of these maps that I just gave you, it's easy to see that if you could travel somehow on Lake Ontario through Lake Erie into Lake Superior, into Lake Michigan, that was a whole lot easier than walking. The key was getting into Lake Erie. The problem with the route that I just described, going through Lake Ontario into Lake Erie, is a little thing called Niagara Falls. It turns out that the length of Lake Ontario involves an elevation, change in elevation of almost 500 feet on the New York side and going up. So the Erie Canal, when it was built, did not go into Lake Ontario, which is what a lot of people assume. It went all the way, bypassing Lake Ontario. It went parallel to it all the way to Lake Erie. And the reason was to get past Niagara Falls. So the Erie Canal was 360 some odd miles. It started out from the Hudson River, went up the Mohawk, and then it went across all the way into Lake Erie. And that opened up all kinds of western migration. I gave a talk up in San Antonio not long ago on the opening of the Erie Canal. It turns out 1817 was the anniversary of the start of construction. So I wrote a paper for our heritage on the Erie Canal and did a little talk on that. But that opened up and changed dramatically. And if you look at the chart that talks about how fast you could go across the U.S., if you look at the rates of travel in 1800 as compared to the rate of travel in 1830, the difference between those two pages is the Erie Canal. There was no other physical change in transportation modes between 1800 and 1830. It was all in the Erie Canal. And it drastically reduced the amount of time it took to get to places like the future home of Chicago or Detroit, areas like that, into Indiana and Illinois. Okay? Once the Erie Canal opened up, we had the Industrial Revolution all taking place at that same time. and we had the trains coming into play. And the chart that shows 1857 really reflects the fact that trains all of a sudden were dominating the eastern half of the United States. Now, they did not go, as of 1857, trains did not go all the way to the West Coast. That wasn't until after the Civil War, when we had the Golden Spike driven out in Utah. So up to the time of the Civil War, we had train transportation up to the Mississippi and not a lot beyond that. So how did people get from the Mississippi River to the gold fields of California or down here to Texas or wherever else they were going? Well, it turns out
Down to Galveston, I imagine.
the one way that they went, or the ways that they went, I should say, are illustrated in a couple of other handouts. If you go by television shows from the 50s, when there were a lot of westerns on and wagon train was on, people rode in wagons. Well, that's part true. People's belongings rode in wagons. If they owned clothes, if they owned furniture, those went in the wagons. The people walked. They didn't ride horses. In fact, horses were pretty scarce back then. In order to pull the wagons, they did not use horses. The horses would break down. They used oxen and mules. So if you see a television show or a movie where they're have horses pulling wagons, nah, that didn't happen. If you see people riding in the wagons, nope, that didn't happen either. So if you have ancestors that came from the East Coast or anywhere else through the Midwest and wound up here in Texas or out in California or wherever else, they walked. And if you think about that, so, and the way they got there was by following these trails that are shown on that last handout I just gave you. There are western trails. One chart is from the 1840s and 50s. The second one changes a little bit from 1850 to 65. It shows where they were going. And the third chart is a little bit peculiar to Texas because it also shows the cattle trails that were used as well as the railroads as they came into play. So, in order to wrap this up so you can get to your meeting, we have one more handout that I want to focus on, and that's one of those western trails from 1840 to 1850 was the one most commonly used, and that was the Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail is very interesting. Now I know we don't have any projection capability, so this is the best we can do. You'll see those markers on the last handout that I gave you. Fort Kearny, Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, Scotts Bluff, Fort Laramie, Independence Rock, and then several others. Those are literally the signposts that people followed. Nancy and I had the opportunity to go with our daughter and a couple of grandkids a couple of years ago to follow the trail a little bit. This one is the first one of the signposts. This is Courthouse Rock and Jailhouse Rock.
If you ever get up to the Omaha, north of Omaha, where it came across the Mississippi, years ago my mom and I visited relatives in Iowa, went across, and we stopped at a little roadside up there, and they said, this is the start of the Oregon Trail, and I thought, where? And they said, look, and you can look out across that farmland, and all of a sudden it goes down.
Yeah,
As far as you can see, you can still see
Still
that
see
trail.
where.
The next milestone on there is Chimney Rock. And boy, if that doesn't look like a chimney out in the middle of the plain, I don't know what does. After Chimney Rock is Scotts Bluff.
That's
And
probably where you were talking about, Scott.
this is where we stayed actually, and that's where they talk about being the beginning of the Oregon Trail. Turns out it's also the beginning of the Mormon Trail and the California Trail. They all went through Scotts Bluff. And if you can see,
Now, what state is that?
that's in Nebraska, western Nebraska.
I'm talking about eastern Nebraska, where it goes
Okay.
right across the bridge.
Fort Kearney.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
fascinating.
And Scotts Bluff is just a remnant of a mountain, I guess you'd call it. But there's an opening there, and that's the opening that they aim for. And we were staying at a bed and breakfast right there, so that's where we were taking these pictures from. And that is part of the Scotts Bluff Historical Park, where they have a wagon train. That's our daughter and her family there. But they have a wagon sitting there as a demonstration, and you can go in there and
See how small those wagons were?
these were not big. This is a view from up on Scotts Bluff looking east. And there is nothing. And you can see Scotts Bluff coming from maybe 40 to 50 miles away. And you can follow the Chimney Rock and the Jailhouse Rock. So these milestones stood out, and they literally followed them from rock to rock. But the key one, well, I think it's still a couple more yet. The next one is Register Cliff. And Register Cliff is interesting because it's a limestone cliff, and it turns out that people could carve their names and dates in it. And they did. Just like graffiti artists today in New York City. Well, every inch of Register Cliff is even up 20 feet high. Somehow they were climbing up there. Anything to scratch their names. And you can go there today. There's a fence that keeps you from defacing it. But you can actually read the names of about half the people that went through there. And it's kind of fascinating. Most of them date from the 1850s. And they're still there. There's also a place called the Oregon Trail Ruts, which is in, I'm trying to read, it's right on the Nebraska-Wyoming border. I'm really not sure which state it's in. But if you go there, there's this rut, and you say, wait a minute. That photo's deceiving because the rut's about 3 feet wide. Well, that's the width of the wagons. What had happened was the wagon wheels were digging into the limestone, and the settlers, as they were going through, had to chip away the center so that the axles would pass over it. Otherwise, they would get stuck on there. So the 3 foot represents the width of the axles, and that's how small those were. The last one that I'm going to talk about is a place called Independence Rock. And why is it called Independence Rock? Anybody have any ideas? That's where the wagon trains had to be, or the wagons had to be, in order to survive the winter by the 4th of July. If they did not pass Independence Rock before the 4th of July, the chances of making it to California were slim and none. The Donners did not, as an example. And that was a specific milestone. I've done a lot of research on this, and it turns out the wagon masters, or the people that led the trains, there were 2 different groups of men. One group would lead them from Missouri to Independence Rock, The other group would lead them from Independence Rock to the west coast. And one of the men in 1852 stopped by a newspaper office in St. Joseph's, Missouri, and gave them a list. On the way back, just out of interest, he had taken the wagon train from Missouri to Independence Rock and then walked back, and along the way he decided to keep track of the graves that he found. And he recorded 160 some odd graves that were marked with people, copied down the names and gave them to the newspaper editor in St. Joseph's, Missouri, who published them in his newspaper. And that's thanks to an aborted effort by Google. At one time, Google decided to put all the old newspapers online. They started doing it and then realized how much it was going to cost and stopped. But they had done that one paper from St. Joseph's, Missouri, and it's still accessible online. But it's quite interesting to see the toll of people. They estimated how many people were dying on the trail each year, and it was in the thousands.
I've heard of as many as 7 per mile.
So it was not easy to get through there. This is a photograph of one of the wagon trains. It's an early photograph. And you can see people walking. You can see the horses are being pulled by burros and oxen. No horses. Nobody's riding. They walked along and led the horses. They didn't sit there with a buggy whip or anything. They walked alongside the horses and led the horses. Mules and oxen. Horses were too expensive and they broke down too easily. If you're here, if your family was here in the 1840s, I know that's where Somerset got settled from a group of settlers from Kentucky, I believe. They walked here.
They walk.
They were hardy souls, a lot hardier than we are today.
I want to ask you a question. I had a grandfather that left down by southeast Texas. He went back to Alabama. His grandfather had left him money. Okay. And this is in, I think he went in 1858. Now, when he wore, that's before the railroad in Texas, right?
Yeah.
In 58. Now, did he go like in a wagon? Did he ride this horse? Or did he maybe go down to the coast and go around and up? How do you think he went back to Alabama?
I think he probably walked. I mean, the way you got from San Antonio to Louisiana was on the Camino Real. They were still using that as a primary way. And the Natchez Trace across Louisiana into
Alabama.
Natchez Trace goes all the way.
I didn't. You don't think he rode a horse?
We could have it.
He could have if he had the money for it, but I mean the trouble with horses again is they get tired pretty easily.
No, only one.
More often than not, if you went with a horse, you wound up walking with it halfway.
Oh, okay.
Horses do not have the stamina nor the ability to take 200 pounds for a long time.
Okay.
If you have a horse or a burro, you're much better off putting your provisions on the horse and walking beside it.
I've always tried to picture in my mind how he went back.
Yeah.
How he went back to get that money.
If there were banks in the area, even the telegraph was rare then at that time. So does anyone have any other questions? Or, yes,
This
ma'am?
is awesome, just awesome.
I'm trying to do some math here, and when was Plymouth Rock? What years?
1620, wasn't it?
1622.
Oh, 1622. And then you said your ancestor was 1703.
1705, when he built his house.
When he built the house.
His father was in New Amsterdam in 1647. He was born, the man that built the house in 1705 was born in 1654.
I never have understood how my grandfather, why did they go north up towards Temple and whatever? I don't have the answer yet.
That's
Why
where
did they
land
go
grants
there?
were. Land grants were there.
Land grant through there?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of the Germans that came over were going to, like the Fisher Miller one, which is up around New Braunfels. And they came across and went up.
They went further, because I was wondering, why'd they go further? Because everybody went to New Braunfels,
Yes,
Fredericksburg.
there were entrepreneurs who were going over or had representatives in Germany that were selling the Germans on the prospect of buying land.
Yeah.
So they'd commit to buying the land, they'd pay their
Their way.
way
So
over
that's
here,
it.
and then they'd go, surprise.
Yeah.
Don't have anything.
Well, they were guaranteed, oh, we're gonna give you all the provisions you need, and they get there and there were no provisions.
Different parts of Germany, different areas came over at different times. One of our daughters-in-law, her family's been in Brenham since 1869, and her ancestor was a female who had 3 sons and a daughter, and came over with them to marry a guy who was already in Brenham. And they came over in 1868 through Galveston. We know that one came when they came over. New Braunfels settlements were closer to 1850.
The fascinating thing about all of this is that in today's time, we have young people that have no idea that Texas is this young. You know, well, we're really young, Texas.
Yeah.
So it's all a learning process.
This, by the way, is Midwestern State University.
Oh, okay. Well, you've taught us a lot tonight. We really thank you
Yes,
for enlightening us on it.